It is Kristi. It is Sunday. That means it is time for Weekend Winters. How are you all doing? I hope you are doing very well. Wondering why my desktop audio has some naughty stuff behind it. I don't even know what that is. Anyway, how are you all doing? There's a helicopter. I don't know if you can hear that. You probably can. It's ridiculously loud. But yeah, it's Sunday and we're going to do some qualitative case study research design. Here is my thinking. Oftentimes, when I do a research methods course, you kind of present things in an order that makes sense when it comes to things you have to know before you know other things, right? However, it can also be the case that, like, if you set so much up at the beginning and you don't connect it to things at the end, then things like connections might not seem obvious. So even though we haven't discussed too much about like transcription work or data processing, data documentation, coding or other ways of analysis, or even writing it up, I think it's a useful exercise to take what we've understood so far and use it to build a research design so that you can see how the logic of things go together. And how do you think rigorously about a question in order to have data sufficient to analyze whether or not there's any there, right? And that's ultimately what our goal is. Today I wanted to kind of riff a little bit on what we did last time and come up just spontaneously with a hypothetical, made up, completely fictional case study research design. Before we start that, I want to say hello to some people in the chat. So as you can see, I've been trying to organize our space here a little bit more by moving things around. I know people like lava lamp, so I've been trying to put a bit more lava lamp into into our time together, and hopefully that'll be very exciting and enjoyable for people. So hello to Flint. I see DN fan in the chat. Thank you for stopping by and spending your day with me. All right, hold on a second. ZXV or ZXV writes, "Hey Kristi, did you see that Andy Worski something Salt Poppy Boxing Fest yesterday? What am I making? Oh, I did not see that. I did not see Worski doing anything yesterday, so I'll need to check that out. Thanks for the tip. Thanks for the heads up on that. All right. If I missed you, Paul. Hello, good morning, Paul. I've scrolled up and down now. Please give a shout out to my friend Schwalby262 who left YouTube. Oh no, sorry about that. Hopefully it was just getting bored. And John Henry, Easy7 also here. Good to see you all. All right, let's remind ourselves a little bit what we talked about last time, because case studies are like the most flexible form of analyzing something, because case studies, they're like a salad bar, right? If you go to, it's like going to a salad bar rather than going to like a pizza place. If you go to a pizza place, let's say, a pizza place is focus group research. Well, you're going to need 4 to 12 participants maximum per group. And you're going to need, there's a lot of things that you can already infer if you go, all right, I'm going to use focus groups to collect this data, or I'm going to use interviews to collect this data. Whatever it happens to be, when you do it, I'm going to fade that out a little bit. Once you make that decision, there are a lot of other decisions that are made for you. A case study, though, it's pick and mix. It's match your own. It's really anything you want to throw into it. And as a consequence, it's super, super flexible and useful. But on the other hand, you can be a little overwhelmed and lost because there is so much flexibility. You can kind of be lost for choice. We're going to talk today. Also, I'm really super paranoid. Does my voice sound good? I had that terrible... Yes, Elgato. All right, my very expensive mic is working this time. Okay, let's review a little bit about what we saw about case studies last time. And why is there this window here? I don't want that. Can I close this? Oh... God, you really freaking suck. I really, really despise academia.edu sometimes. Anyway, what a case study is based on is a descriptive research format. Its aim is not to generalize to a population. It's to look deeply at a small participant pool, and I would argue make conceptual generalizations. Oh, good. All right. Thanks, Flint, for the feedback. So I'm toying with this idea in a paper I'm currently working on with my co-author, Adzia Carvalho, where we're dealing with the question of replicating qualitative research, which is an under-discussed topic in qualitative research because honestly, like, replication isn't a high priority. We're not trying to generalize. But on the other hand, we want to know whether or not the concepts that we're evaluating are applicable to, other locations, other people. And as a consequence, there's an argument being made, I can't remember the author, that, the purpose of qualitative research is to establish analytic generalization. We're generalizing about concepts, not about people. And this is really, really important because it's the distinguishing line between the attempts to become statistically representative, in other words, the focus of quants, in order to really make sure that it's a representative sample of the population, regardless of what is found inside of it. And on the other side, you have analytic generalization, which is about establishing the existence of concepts regardless of whether it's for a small population or a large population, whether it's widely held or narrowly held. That is not the goal, I would argue. It's rather to establish the existence of the concept and how it exists and how it is used. So let's say in a case study, right, we're interested in doing some descriptive research format. We want to look deeply at individuals and we want to draw some conclusions. As I said last time, it's quite flexible. It focuses on context. It is there to really look at the subjectivity, right? And there is an importance there of understanding where people are. So there's talking about researcher subjectivity, but let's talk about really getting into subjectivity. I'm going to say that for the purposes of today, I was trying to think of what could we do as a good case study that just made up at the top of the head, but enough information that people could generally understand it without having to, know a lot of the theory. And I've actually had this idea for a very long time that I want to really understand better anti-feminist arguments in first, second, and third wave feminist movements. So here we go. All right. So anti-feminism, anti-feminist rhetoric existed since the emergence of, and even before, first wave feminism. First. Hold on. Your screen. I need to move my screen a little bit. I've got this one screen that makes it. Never mind. Doesn't matter. All right. Now you'll be able to see it better. Come on. Yes. Okay. There we go. Is that font big enough for y'all? I made it 20. It might not be. I'll tell you what. I'll bump it up a little bit. Okay. So my question is anti-feminist rhetoric has existed alongside of feminist rhetoric since the emergence of first wave feminism. However, because feminism has basically been accepted as, how should we say this? There are certain core principles that are no longer debated within feminism. Thanks for the feedback, Flint. Yet those areas had to be contested initially. So my question is, debates around, because feminists basically won the arguments, we tend to focus on the winning arguments and we don't understand the losing arguments. A parallel to this is the way that civil rights discourse and civil rights discussions are usually framed in terms of how the winners see history, but what is not, I think, fairly presented is the virulent, rhetoric used by the anti-side. So the people who are opposing progress, opposing human rights, opposing human equality principles, their discourses generally exist, but they're understudied. So my question is, okay. So I want to do some kind of case study that will need to be, at least for the first two waves, textual for waves 1 and 2 of feminism, because I mean, we would have video tapes, like a news stuff from the 1970s, but it wouldn't be as easy to find because it's all physical, does exist physically, whereas a lot of textual stuff is still online or digitized or much easier to get than newsreel reports or, local newspaper reports about an anti-feminist demonstration. So we want to study, case study, like, let's call it like discourse. Right? And here by discourse, I mean the words, the language, the norms, the values used to construct the argument. So a case study on the discourse for anti-feminist rhetoric. I can spell rhetoric, which I can't because I have my fingers in the wrong place on the keyboard, in waves 1 and 2, in feminist waves 1 and 2. And then some sort of expanded, because we have more ways to communicate since third wave feminism, expanded collection post.com explosion of the 90s. The idea here is that in order to get a sense of generally anti-feminist rhetoric, we want to do a case study that looks quite closely at anti-feminist rhetoric, maybe in reference to some feminist ideas, so we understand the context of how people are framing their opposition to basic human rights for women. That's not a loaded statement. This is like, and for those who, and yes, so get a sense of that. And we know that the primary form of communication we're going to be able to access for the late 19th century, early 20th century time period is going to be purely written text. So we want to carry that through a little bit because we don't want, there's something called mode effects. And it just says that if you try to compare things in different modes that they exist, it might be harder to compare. So for instance, if you want to compare a letter to the editor to someone doing a person on the street interview, a letter to the editor will be much more organized because someone has a lot of time to think about it, whereas a spontaneous utterance that you give as a response to a question might really have a lot of effects, recency biases or media biases, media recency effects, all these sorts of things that they're not thinking carefully, right? So we know that in order to be comparable across 3 time points, it is going to be good to ground our analysis in the written word, ideally, but that doesn't necessarily exclude us from using other forms of more modern communication. So we want to, and what is, let's go back to our thing and say, what is our goals here? So that is our question, is really trying to understand, I would say, so what is the, in terms of what is my question? Right? If this is as simple as like, thank you, Pete Bloom, for informing me about this. I'm sure he didn't come up with it. But what is my question? And it is to understand the stability of anti-feminist content, anti-feminist concepts and values over, well, guys, about like 150 years of discourse. So a subset to this would be which values emerge in time periods. Now, are there different, do they change over time? Say which periods, which values, what's the word I'm looking for here? Some fade and some are sustained. Right? So which ones last? Which values last over time? Which get abandoned? For instance, let me give you an example of this so I can give you an idea of the sort of content I'm interested in here. The idea that women who women who want to get involved in politics are bad mothers. It's linking this idea to women's roles in the public sphere as being evidence that they are deficient in the private sphere. Today, I get it that there are still people who, complain that mothers don't do enough if they work full time. However, in early first wave feminism, this idea of working outside the house or having your own life it was basically like keep you in your house kind of mentality, right? Women riding bicycles, right? Like was scandalous. So so in this case, feminists won the argument that women can balance a home life and their family life like anyone else can. So that one kind of got thrown to the side. Another very antiquated argument is that politics is just such a skeezy, dirty, manipulative place, and women are so pure and beautiful, just like these innocent things, and they have this sort of wholesomeness to them, that if we allow women to get into politics, it will taint them. Politics is dirty work. It's like asking women to become garbage collectors or to do physical manual labor that women have always been doing anyway, if I'm honest. But we would need to protect women from the dirty experience of politics. People generally don't make that argument anymore. So that was an abandoned one. However, there are ideas that have lasted over time. For instance, this, I think, cognitive dissonance, which states that, well, look, women and men are equal, but really men should be in charge of the important things like earning money and running businesses and doing politics and running the world. And then women should be in charge of, things like cleaning the house and making sure the kids have a clean face and making sure there's enough toilet paper. And that's equality, because you see, both people have their own special roles. Both people have their own special spheres, and so they're equal. It's just that the kinds of things they do are different, which is, so I would argue that complementarianism has evolved over time, but the basic idea that there are separate spheres linked, like grounded in your genitalia, that make you good or bad at something, and that, of course, all of the power and money and status jobs go to men, and everything else goes to women, or like being disparaging about people who don't fit into this binary. And that's just meant to reinforce a hierarchy that's unjustified and has always existed and needs to be overturned. So that is the main question. Understanding the stability of anti-feminist concepts and values over 150 years of discourse. Now we've got a general question, right? So that's my question. What is my question? Understanding the stability. What is my answer? I don't know yet. I don't know what my answer is, because this is exploratory research, right? I don't have a theory to go from. I don't have a hypothesis to test from. So what is my answer? At this point, I don't know. Dunno. Why should you believe me? This is the next question. And actually what I can do is, what is my question? I'll put a little italicize on that so that you can kind of distinguish between them. And I don't need the space here then. Why should you believe me? This question goes to the credibility of multiple things. One, your research design; two, your data collection and preparation, your data analysis, and the conclusions you draw. All of those things need to be transparent and up for debate so that people can make up their own minds. So the question is why should you believe me, is because I say so, or because the Bible said so, or because it's all based on the evidence. And that makes us think, what evidence is sufficient to be convincing in this case? Why should you believe me, and why should you care? The why should you care question goes to the relevance of this research either to a current body of research or to people's lives. In other words, you just need to be explicit about, why you should care about this. Maybe it's new information that we've never come across before. Maybe we can, for instance, for a feminist activist, we can look back at this history of anti-feminist discourse, understanding how they keep changing the rhetoric, but the core beliefs about women's inferiority, or anyone who isn't a straight, cis, heterosexual white man in European and American and English, in the English-speaking world, and European generally, how those inequalities manifesting in the 21st century even though the discourse is nothing like it was in the 1890s. So you should be able to answer all of these questions. And that is what has, sorry, I got all distracted for a second there. So we have these points, and we want to come back to our case study. So we generally have, I think we can go to our notes here. We want thick description. We want perhaps triangulation of methods. And now we can try to think about, okay, what type of case study is really going to help us answer our questions? We have a real broad choice when it comes to the ways we want to collect our data. So when it comes to our data, we know we've limited it a little bit. We want to be able to compare across time, so we know we're using text, or we're giving priority to text in this case. We know that newspapers and opinion pages are going to be a primary source in the past, so we're going to have to do some comparative stuff. But because now is now, we don't have to limit ourselves. We can go deeper and more enriching ourselves in our modern period because, maybe we want to look at sermons given by far-right pastors that justify women's inferiority in a Christian framework, which is something that is probably was being spoken about back in the day, but we don't have access to those sermons. So we don't have to limit ourselves in our investigation, but we do need to keep some sort of question about comparability over time, comparability over data collection, just because we know that that is something reviewers care about and we'll have to be able to explain and justify when it comes to our data collection. So maybe within our case study, we're going to have like a case study that looks at other media, maybe, TikTok anti-feminism or TikTok feminism, something like that. But we have a lot of choices and a lot of freedom in our qualitative case study approach because we are doing exploration. So we're looking at exploratory or pilot studies. It's condensed case studies to perform before a large-scale one, or we might want to do some exploratory sample work before we determine what our final data collection mode will be. Perhaps it's the case that Tumblr is going to be really important, or something else is going to be important. We're not going to know till we get out there. So we want to have a general framework, but we want it flexible enough to be able to adapt, so that we're not locked in and missing potential data. Are we doing a cumulative case study? Are we aggregating information from several sites or over time? Yeah, that's kind of an idea here of a way we can think about it, is that we're gathering data from feminist and anti-feminist and really over-researching the anti-feminist stuff because it has been under-researched at this time point and this time point and this time point. And we want to make some greater generalizations. So we could perhaps think about framing it in terms of a cumulative case study. Or maybe, right, we've got critical instances case studies. Perhaps we want to focus more on a vote. Let's just be really American-centric, right? Because at least then I can draw on knowledge, a general body of knowledge I have. That we want to look at discourses around maybe not the women's right to vote, although that would be a popular one, but maybe, let's just take it, make it easy, right? So we want to look at a critical instance of when the 19th Amendment was ratified by Congress and moved to the states, and then look at state-level discourse in 1917 or whenever it was. I think it passed in 1919, so however long, maybe it was like 1914, whatever it is, that time period. Then we could also move forward and look at the ERA, which was the big piece of big political move in the second feminist wave movement, which also passed Congress and managed to get through like 35 state legislatures, but ultimately failed. Now, these are really interesting critical instances case studies because you have one example of white people having their own internal discourse in the early 1900s about giving rights to white women. And they didn't say that, but it was implied because black women, black people generally weren't seen as human beings by the legal structures of white America at the time, and still don't really. But then there was a discussion about, white men giving white women the right to vote and participate in politics versus the ERA, which also included backlash from the civil rights movement. And, you've got also probably like abortion rights being expanded. So the kinds of women who were being given rights in the ERA debate was very different. It's quite easy for like a racist group of white people to give each other rights because it's still maintaining white hegemony. Giving white women the right to vote wasn't a threat to white men. It would just change how they competed. Do you see what I'm saying? Whereas the ERA would give all women more rights and undermine the patriarchy. So we could think about it as a critical instance, and then we can also kind of bring it forward and maybe do a post-Roe critical instance case study where we look very narrowly at the discourses around, that debate. Now, it's not entirely, I'm just kind of riffing here, but you see how a critical instance would be a sample around a specific parallel event in order to understand that heightened focus on that. And of course, the ERA debate was quite different from the right to vote debate, but that can be part of the analysis, that giving women the right to vote is a quite limited right that is only exercised in a very limited way and has a very limited impact. Whereas when you give people human rights, when you give all people human rights, you're fundamentally restructuring the way that power is reordered. All right, so that's a way we could do it with a critical instance case study. So my point here is to show you there isn't a right or wrong way to do a case study. There's good and bad ways to do case studies, but there isn't a right or wrong way. It depends on your question. It depends on the data you have available. And depends on what you're valuing in your research. So your 5 questions should be your research studies question, any proposed hypotheses. So in this case too, we would be very well advised to read around the literature, probably get outside of political science, go into political history, look at any feminist historians who've maybe taken a look at tracking anti-feminist discourse over time. There's a lot of things that might inform what we think we might find based on other people's prior research. And that's good because it saves us time from reinventing the wheel, because we are busy people. It's way easier to read someone else's research than reinvent it. Then we want to make a clear case as to the units of our analysis. What's the time period we're looking at? What are the events associated that we're looking at? These kinds of questions you need to be very clear on, at least initially, so that you can, otherwise there's just too much data out there. So you need to go narrow initially, and you can always broaden your scope. But if you start out broad and you try to narrow, you might not know what's important. You need to think logically about how these concepts connect. What is the link between anti-feminism and patriarchy and Christianity? Because that is the important cultural influence. And there might be, as I said, that link to complementarianism, which is very popular in first wave anti-feminist rhetoric, but comes from a religious perspective. These are the kinds of things that you need to explain to your readers or your peer reviewers, depending on where you are in the process, or your PhD supervisor, in order to be clear about the claims that you're going to be making and the logic that links them. And then also in terms of interpreting your findings. So then let's say we've got a general framework. We want to look at the use of language and values and concepts in these 3 time periods. We have limited our data a little bit initially so that we can get a handle on these 3 time periods. And we want to do a little case study initially where we may do a little sample in the early 20th century, the middle 20th century, and then the late 20th century, early 21st. So we're going to be going late 19th to the early 21st, taking 3 time periods that fit the 3 waves of feminist activism. And then we probably want to do a little dip in, right? Case studies will be more convincing and accurate if they are based on several different sources of information. Cross-checking the data from multiple sources can provide a multi-dimensional profile of activities and settings. Now, with human beings, you do that by talking to different people. With texts, you might want to just sample, like a newspaper in Birmingham, England, and then one in Birmingham, Alabama, and then maybe one in New York City. And you might want to just get, some letters to the editor that are from an anti-feminist perspective. You might want to get articles covering news events around the debate around the 19th Amendment. You might want to get pamphlets and publications, if they've been preserved, that are out there convincing people that it's really important that we protect women from politics by not getting them involved and giving them the right to vote. Like, how do people rationalize this? And from our point of view, it is so, at least for me, it is so incomprehensible that anyone could ever argue women should not have a basic human right, that, I need to really spend time understanding the 19th century worldview. So we want to go in there, and, we shouldn't just collect data from pastors. And pastors, I think, spend a lot of time complaining about women generally. But, so we might get some conservative politicians. We might just get your average person. We might get to find some women. Like, anti-feminist women obviously were pushed forward by anti-feminist men because they like to use other people as a shield, just like racist white people want to hide behind people of color who will mouth their rhetoric that preserves white hegemony. So too do male anti-feminists want to hide behind anti-feminist women, use them to say, hey, this woman in public is going to tell you that women in public is dangerous and women belong in the house. But because she's saying what I want, it's fine for her to talk in public, right? So that way we would be able to say, well, the pastors were saying this. The women might have been, just saying what they've been heard, but, like women who are speaking up against it. Are there other civil groups, right? We want to get a general sample in order to see if they were, it's like this thing about today. They're marketing their arguments toward their audience. Right? They're going to shape it. So how are these people trying to be convincing? Yeah, they really got a twofer with Candace Owens. Absolutely. Okay. We're going to do a little sample there. Let's say we're going to take from like a couple different English-speaking countries that were going through the same. So probably Britain, the United States for sure. I don't know much about Canadian history, but if it was possible, because this English-speaking world, it really shouldn't matter what country you're in. The rhetoric, the discourse shouldn't change because the values are going to be anti-feminist. And my prediction would be that all anti-feminist values will share common value features underlying them. So as long as, it really should rise above national locations or nationality, because we're not talking about an American value, we're talking about an global anti-feminist value. Therefore, we should, So we'll take this initial first wave anti-feminist rhetoric and we'll read through it. And then initially, let's just say we're going to do some coding. And we're going to come to data analysis and data processing a little bit later in my lectures. But for now, what I'm going to say, it's pretty obvious, right? We're going to be informed by Glaser and Strauss's grounded theory methods approach to qualitative data analysis, which just means we are going to ground our theory in the data. So our data is going to, if any theories emerge, they're going to emerge from the data, not from us making guesses and deducting. It would be data-led. And the other idea is theoretical saturation. Theoretical saturation in terms of concept validity is the equivalent of having a good sample size. Right? In statistics and quants, if you have a sample size of 200, that is probably within 3 or 4 points of the, or maybe 5, let's call it 5 percentage points of the true value in the population, right? Let's say the true value of Trump's approval rating, like Biden's approval rating in the population is 45. That is like, we can't know that, but if someone were to, like some omnipotent being were to look into it, the number is 45. With a sample of 250 Americans randomly selected, we would guess that we would get a number between, if we want to do a 5% margin of error and the real number is 45, somewhere between 40 and 50, right? Because 45 is our center point of that 10-point range. Right? And then we can say with some degree of certainty the range of this number. But when we come to do theoretical grounded theory method, the way that we establish the existence of the reliability of the idea is that it's from the data, and when we've kind of gone to the data and pulled out concepts, we're not getting anything new. We've looked at a bunch of texts, we've looked at a bunch of sources, we've talked to a bunch of people, and initially everything was new. Right? Because it was exploratory. So we get, let's say, 7 concepts in our first data collection round. And then we go back and we talk to some people about those concepts. And we realize like 2 of them are kind of unique to that situation, but 5 of them emerge again. Right? And then we go and we collect some more data. And these same 5 concepts now not only emerge, but we can sort of like see the same words are being used. You're like, oh, I see people are describing this in the same way. This one concept is being described, it may be in different words, but it's the same concept being described. And then when we go out and talk to people about this question, we're not getting any new data. Everything people told us, we've heard it before. If you get to the point where you're not getting anything new, at the moment, basically, like, you could keep going out and collecting more data. But if you can make the case, I've done 3 interviews since establishing this concept and I'm not getting anything new out of it, or I've done another 30 articles and I'm not seeing any new takes on this, you can go, okay, I think this is saturated in terms of the dimensions of the concept, and I'm going to call this the day. I'm going to say this is a concept and this is the dimensions of it, those words or values or whatever they are. And so that is the goal of qualitative, or in this case, grounded method theory, is to get to the point where you can establish the existence of a concept and you can point to your data and say, all of my data, I've exhausted the limits of the boundaries of this concept. So you might want to try that first with a little sample to see how it goes. And then, so let's say we did a first wave feminism preliminary analysis, and we took just 15 pieces of information. We've coded them for values. We've coded them for concepts that people connect together. We've tried to characterize what the persuasive argument being made at the core of the writing is. And then we're going to set that aside. We go, okay, we've got this concept we think is pretty well defined, or at least the starts of the outline. We might find more because this is just like a little pilot study. And then we do the same thing with some second wave data, looking for a similar concept, or seeing whether or not a similar concepts emerge. And let's say it does emerge, but the framing of it is different, or maybe a new value has been added, or maybe a value has been taken away. So even though the concept is the same, the dimensions of it are now slightly different. The core so think about the way that, just how white Americans' racist attitudes, they give a little bit, but then it kind of they change the narrative as to why racism is over. Right after the civil rights, so after slavery, racist white America was like, well, you're free now. You got what you wanted. We're done with you. And then after the civil rights movement, racist white America was like, oh, well, you have your civil rights. Now shut up, right? You've got your equal now. We're done with you. And then Barack Obama became president. And they went, oh, racism is over because, one black man became president of the United States. That proves that we're not a racist country anymore. Stop your complaining about your experiences being beaten by police or being mistreated by the systems generally. Right. Anyway, I'm getting out on a tangent. Flint says, are we not in danger of presupposing to an extent, though? How do we guard against this? Well, again, in this case, we're not doing deductive hypothesis testing. We are doing an exploratory research, so we can't go in completely blind. So, part of when it comes to the presupposition or the predictions of what we might find in the data, initially should be grounded in your literature review. You should read around this to find out what has already been established. And if a concept like complementarianism has been incredibly well established and discussed in the literature for the last 40 or 50 years, well, then you're not so much presupposing as you are taking what should be there and then going and doing an investigation, an exploratory investigation. Because the opposite of that is to go in with a completely open mind, but then you don't know what you're looking for. And so I think what you're worried about is if you go looking for a certain thing, you're going to just collect the data related to that thing and you're not going to see anything else, and you're going to cherry pick your data collection, you're going to cherry pick your data analysis, and you're going to cherry pick your data findings presentation. Is that a possibility? Yes. How do we counter that in Qual? One is transparency, researcher transparency. Right? I'm a feminist. I'm absolutely feminist. And I understand feminist rhetoric really, really well. I don't understand anti-feminist rhetoric. And so my research is really, in many ways, me as a feminist coming to anti-feminist rhetoric and investigating it. Now, am I claiming some objective truth about anti-feminism? I'm not. That's the job of quants. they can try to use numbers to say, well, like we're just measuring what we're measuring. Although that's presupposition in how the questions are framed in the social sciences too. So even in economics and stuff. So it's not like without bias. So I'd say that is, one is researcher transparency, two is data transparency, three is for in the peer review process to have other people come in and read your core data. That is the basis, just like you would for your quants. Look at your core database, look at your analysis, and ask, like, is this well grounded? Is this something that I find credible based on like this data collection mode and the analysis done? And if you're not credible, your peers, that's the job of peer review. You're not meant to get through peer review if you haven't done a good job on your research design. So, okay, let's see. Single method or multi-method here, if we want to do, we can't go back in time, but if we could, we maybe want to do some interviews of current anti-feminists or watch some videos. So like I said, initially it makes sense to compare text or anything written down in using textual words in order to have some comparison over time, but you're not limited by that. You can think about using TikTok videos or using, I don't know, old websites from the 90s, whatever else. And when it comes to, other thing too is if you're going to be dealing with people, you have more ethical responsibilities than you're just dealing with data. So what are some of the ways that we can think about analyzing our data when we organize it and present it? If we are dealing with a lot of people in interviews and focus groups or in ethnography, some kind of like, being embedded in the location, well, then we're going to want to talk about the people's roles, the roles of the participants. That might be a way we can think about framing. Come on, stupid page. Okay. Analysis of informal exchanges among individuals or groups. I think this is really more about like settings. For instance, if you're studying a business, you're studying management practices, you're studying how a campaign is organized, basically how the social services system works, where people have, roles and authorities and responsibilities, and how do people communicate might be a way you want to look at it. You might take a historical framework approach, which would probably be suitable for this kind of question, is to look at, this is the other thing too, is when we come to this anti-feminist discourse, we have a lot of data there that's not been analyzed from an intersectional perspective, because intersectionality as a framework for understanding things wasn't well articulated until the 1990s. And as a consequence, with our understanding of intersectionality, we might go back to those old debates about women getting the right to vote and really clarify white women. We talk about the fact that this initial first wave feminist debate about the right to vote was really white men and white women talking about white women. And how does that change the ability of the dominant oppressive group to allow more rights to the oppressed when they're within the same racial category? And it also solidifies that insider-outsider dimension. So that might be something we want to take. Maybe it's a thematic framework. Maybe we want to look at the evolution of complementarianism as it's adapted to a moving target of how to value women. I mean, just studying, broadly here, just as a category within the society, because complementarianism as presented in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, is quite different, because they were drawing on an audience's assumption that women belonged in the home. And it was a way easier to make those arguments when you didn't have to convince people women shouldn't be in politics because women shouldn't be outside the home. Like, we all know that, right? And then by the 1970s, people didn't think that anymore. And so complementarianism and, Phyllis Schlafly and the Ego Forum had to find a new way to frame that unjustified hierarchy for a new century. So maybe thematic. Resources evaluation, I don't really know that, but ritual and symbolism, and then critical incidents. As I said, maybe we could look at the 19th Amendment, the ERA failing, and then post-Roe women's activism, or feminist activism, I should say. What we're doing here is we're looking for patterns in the data and patterns that give meaning to our case study. In our case, the question we're asking is, what are the core values that underpin anti-feminist rhetoric? Right? That is layer one. How can we identify those values based on what logic people are using when they connect concepts and terms and things in the world to their values? So we know that the values themselves are latent. People, like, they're the basis upon which other things are formed, right? So we have our value layer here, and then we have the concepts and words that we use to communicate those values. And in order to be convincing, we make connections, which we think are logical arguments. Again, an example, if you think that women were built to be domestic servants, sex providers, and childcare providers, and their job is to service men, because men are the head of the household and they're the kings of their castle, and that hierarchy is not even questioned because it's ordained by God. God wants women to basically be full-time unpaid slaves. Then, if that's your value system, you're going to use certain terms and words and codes, and that identifying those connections is what's going to lead us to the underlying value. So we can't see the value directly. We have to infer the values that people are trying to communicate by the way that they use language concepts, and they connect them together to make a convincing argument. And if you can find different people at different time points using the similar or identical language, then you can say that, yeah, this is a concept that existed over time. For instance, I remember watching this businesswoman, made more money than her husband, right? But was also a Christian, and she went up and said, like, I'm a Christian, I believe in the Bible, and I believe that my husband is the head of our household, but I am the neck that turns the head. And it is this infuriating attempt to frame inequality as equality. Right? This idea that women are equal, but not really, and somehow that exists as, it's good. I would link it, again, as I said in my conversation with Dana, I would link it back to the phrase in Paul, there is no free, no slave, no Jew, no Greek, no male, no female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. Well, how can we be one in Christ Jesus when one person can own another person? You can't be equal if you can own another human being. And yet, because Christianity was the religion of the powerful, they used it in order to justify the oppression of others. So, you're right. It is coming up to Kristi coffee refill time, but I'm just going to blow through because I want to get this done with, because we're pretty close to the end, and I do have to prep for a D&D game tonight, and I have to call my dad, and I still have to figure out an assignment for data. I'm pretty close, but it doesn't matter. Okay, as we're going along in our data collection, what we might find when we know that we're looking for this complementarianism is we might find people keep bringing up this one analogy we haven't heard of, or maybe they would tie complementarianism to another concept that about, I don't know, women's purity or something, whatever garbage they came up with. And it's something that we were aware of, but we didn't realize how much people were citing X in order to justify their complementarianism. In this case, this is when we get new patterns emerging or a new linguistic feature that has been heretofore unexplored. And if it's a case that, if it's a one-off, you go, oh, that's interesting. If you're reading through and it comes up 5 times, you're starting to get a cluster. It might be a subset. Maybe there's, you find as you're doing your textual analysis that pastors tend to quote a specific Bible verse in their justification of denying women the right to vote in the late 19th century, early 20th century debates. And then we find that same Bible verse being quoted by 21st century pastors, but they're not doing it in terms of denying women the vote. They're using it to justify something else. And understanding how this Bible verse has been transformed by anti-feminists to justify inequality for a new age might be something new. Right? Again, this is all I'm just hypothesizing, just speculating, but this is examples of things that you could then report. Like, this is the biblical basis for, the complementarianism worldview, anti-feminist worldview. When we get onto data reporting, I'm not going to deal too much with that because that's a whole other topic. But what I wanted to do was work through an example of how you could get from a question to a body of data that could be the source of analysis, to narrowing that body of potential data sources down to be manageable, to narrowing that down to maybe an initial exploratory or case study, exploratory or pilot case study, where we look very narrowly at our time points of interest on something that we are expecting to, like we expect to find, in order to orient us in our spaces and get a sense of the lay of the land. And perhaps in that exploratory research, we would come up with the emergence of a particular sexist Bible quote appearing in like 40% of, or 50%, or 35% of the things that we are evaluating, that we're the text or the data that we're looking at. And as a consequence, we decide we want to spend a little more time, clustering these together and understand the role of this Bible passage in justifying religious inequality as it pertains to the anti-feminist rhetoric. And once we kind of get the shape of that, maybe we really want to try to contextualize the audience and the authors, right? Because again, I'm just going to point out how intersectionality has really transformed the way that we would think about case studies. Because before, again, with that really vague, give women the right to vote, lie that we are taught, if we really make an effort to explain that these white men are talking about giving rights to white women, and they're doing it in a time period where black men had just gotten the right to vote and white men were looking for white allies. How does that now change the context of understanding anti-feminist rhetoric when it comes to also being in tandem and an ally to white supremacy? That will really provide a different context for the use of anti-feminist rhetoric and why the 19th Amendment was successful and maybe why the ERA wasn't, even though it used the same arguments. Because then we're looking at who has power and who they're looking to give power. Who are they looking? Who are these white men looking to stop oppressing? Or looking to stop a system of oppression aimed at a bunch of people. And this might be this role of this Bible passage might become the thing where you really want to illustrate the adaptability of anti-feminist rhetoric to change over time by tracking this Bible verse from the late 19th century, early 20th century within a white supremacist context, within white American discourse, to the one in the 1970s, which was post-civil rights, and how that, whether or not civil rights impacted the way that discourse was discussed. And then maybe looking at Roe, right? So I think this would be wonderful research. I would really like to see somebody do this. I don't have time, but I feel that, the winners write history, and people are interested in understanding why things won out in the end. But I really do feel like we don't have a deep enough appreciation for the real hate of the anti-segregationists and the real hate of the KKK terrorist campaigns against civil rights, or the real inequality, the fundamental acceptance of human inferiority that exists in religion, that perpetuates a sexual division of power based on the idea that a penis is magic and gives people the ability to rule. And if you don't have, the certain kind of body, then somehow you're deficient. That's not a reality. That is a constructed value that is designed to keep certain people in power, even if they don't deserve it. But we could have this little dip into and evaluate the losing, what's the rhetoric of the losing side? Because the losing side, eventually there's a counter push. Right? There's always a backlash. And then the anti-feminist rhetoric, takes the fore, just like it's now bound up in sort of anti-wokeism. Right. And then you would do your data analysis, you would establish your concepts, you would show how you identified it in the data, you would sort of track it and list your sources, and you would make everything very transparent. And you say, maybe, like this What is that one? Like, Paul, no, Jew, no, Greek. Yeah. No. Oh, Gentile. Yeah. Oh, Greek and Gentile. I guess they were interchangeable to them. Yeah. Galatians 3:28. Maybe what you come up with the end of your research time is a paper called Galatians 3:28, How Inequality Has Evolved in Anti-Feminist Rhetoric Since 1885 or something. Boom. And then Bob's your uncle. And you're done. That wasn't that hard, was it? And that is an example of how you could, again, I'm spitballing all of this, but the whole point is to go through and have an idea and then think, is it plausible? How could I criticize this? How could I do it better? Is there a better data source, or is there something I'm missing? And that's it. All right, hey, look at this. 4 minutes to the top of the hour. I'm keeping you on time at least. I will use this last couple seconds to ask whether or not anyone has questions or comments in the chat. You can see your comments right down there in the bottom. So, oh no, oh well, you don't go away. Okay, you're embedded in my thing. So, let's see. I don't see any questions. Either you're all chill and just like about to fall asleep or doze off, but or I was incredibly clear, which I doubt. So, yeah. Oh, I've got live chat, not the top chat. I have the time, but not the brain for this kind of stuff. I have the brain, but not the time. Like, I find this stuff interesting, and I am nerdy. I just saw a meme about how the Bible says a son is worth more than a daughter. Yeah, precisely. Like, that's a horrible set to talk about. Horrible. There's instructions on how to captive. You have to like, hey, you know what? How good the God of Israel is, how good the monotheistic God of Christianity is. He's like, okay, so after you've kidnapped this woman and you've taken her from her family and you've assaulted her and you've turned her into a domestic servant in your house, I'm going to put a limit on you though. You can't sell her into slavery afterwards. Bible is messed up. All right. Yeah, I hope you found this at least interesting, and at most, it has clarified the ways in which when people talk about doing a case study, you should understand that this is a very broad description and it can have a lot of different components in it. It can take a lot of different approaches. There isn't a right or wrong way to do a case study. There are better and worse ways to do case studies, I would argue. All right. I don't know what we're going to do next week. Should we have a little look? Let's see what's on the list. Oh, topics. Because we're done with case studies now. We don't need to talk about case studies. We've done 2 weeks of them, and that is sufficient. So let me see. Where's the qualitative research methods? That's the sub. I need to like flag this or bookmark it or something. No, that's not what I wanted. They're doing this to me all the time. I want to go back to my page. I want to go back to my qualitative research methods category. Academia.edu is like, it's good, but it's crap. Okay, we are at qualitative research and comparative methods. And then a comparative methods example. Yeah, we could do that for the next 2 weeks. Comparative methods there's going to be a high degree of correlation with case study approaches because comparative methods will use a very similar framework. So yeah, it looks like used in the study of international relations or politics, often associated with positivist epistemology, but logic of comparative method can be used as a qualitative inductive approach, which leads on to quantitative or deductive analyses. Okay, yeah, let's look at comparative methods. Oh, synchronatic and diachronatic. We're going to look at, systematic. John Stuart Mill, most similar. Yay, J.S. Mill. The method of agreement, most similar, most different. Oh, this brings me back to my teaching days. All right, yeah, let's do comparative methods. You can learn a little bit about next, and I'm going to cough. Ready, daddy. That's all I have to say to you. My head is empty. John writes, seems pretty clear. I certainly like how it's discussing different angles and depth. Good. I'm very happy. I'm very glad. Because oftentimes I feel like social research can be quite opaque and difficult to understand how people make their decisions and why they're doing what they're doing. And I'm here to try to clarify those things and make them less confusing. All right. Well, y'all, let me go back. Yeah. Hold on. I'm changing this a little bit because I'm editing on the fly. There we go. More lava lamp. No, this way. Lava lamp is this way. Lava's over here. I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Have a wonderful Sunday or Monday or whatever day it is that you are watching this, whenever it is, wherever it is you are. We will be back here next Sunday unless something happens, in which case I will let you know. And our agenda for the next 2 weeks will be doing the comparative methods and comparative methods example. Audio back, video lagging. Oh. Light is green for me. Getting a slideshow version of the show. What? Anyway, I think I should go and stop while I'm still people can hear me. So until next time, guys, I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Have a great week until then, and we will see each other again very soon. Okay. Oh, what is going on? Oh, I see. It's complaining. Not receiving enough video. My network connection. Anyway, I'm leaving. Bye.